Now that we've covered some of the basics in Module 1, in Module 2, we're going to be covering the foundational elements of the MBTI framework. First, we'll cover everything at a very high level, and then we'll start digging into the deeper parts. If you're already somewhat familiar with the MBTI, you probably noticed that it labels its personality types with a 4-letter code, and they look like this. Note that we're actually not going to cover these 4-letter codes until we've covered the basics of human cognition first. Otherwise, you might fall into the trap of not really being able to judge what those 4-letter codes mean, and then you'll have a false impression of what they're trying to represent. Trust me, I've taught this stuff to a lot of different people, and it always works so much better when we go through the basics first, and it's not boring at all, so don't worry about that. Okay, so let's start from the top. What does the human mind actually do? Well, you can actually consolidate all of the stuff our minds do into 2 main processes. The first is that we take in information, or we perceive it. We'll call this perceiving. And then 2, we make sense of that information, or we judge it. So we'll call this judging. In a nutshell, that's really all the mind does. Where it gets really interesting is when we break down these 2 processes of perceiving and judging and see what actually goes into them. Let's dive into perceiving first. There are 2 main ways that we perceive things. We sense things and we intuit things. Let's talk about what these mean. Starting with sensing. Sensing describes the immediate processing of information taken in by our 5+ senses. Things like you being able to hear my voice or seeing me on your screen, and things like your internal sense of temperature and balance even. It is experiencing the moment around you, being present to all sensory stimuli. We also all have subjective recollections of things that we've experienced in the past. That is, our memories. For instance, think back to that long time ago when this video first started playing. Just replay that in your head. That's also a type of sensing that our minds can do. We remember past experiences, and we also feel a sense of comfort and familiarity with things that we've experienced before. All right, the next way we perceive things is by using our intuition. At a super high level, intuition is what we sometimes call imagination. As we accumulate experiences throughout our lives, our minds are constantly accumulating an intuitive understanding of the world. This understanding is not something concrete like the things that you can point to in the memories that you have. It's more about making patterns in your mind based on the things that you see. The patterns themselves are not concrete, but they are based on concrete experiential data. Our minds then use these patterns to make guesses as to what's going to happen next. Things that we consider normal are patterns that we've seen before, and things that we consider weird typically refers to patterns that we just haven't seen before. We use our intuition for a couple main things. One way is to run simulations in our heads, either to try to predict the future or to see something from a different imaginary perspective. Another way is just through random ideation. Imagine a writer's room for a comedy TV show where everybody's just throwing out random ideas for jokes. Like, oh, what if, okay, but what if then we, and then maybe if we... Intuition is pretty much all about pattern recognition for prediction and ideation. That's it. Now that we've talked about the 2 types of perceiving that we do, let's jump over and talk about the 2 types of judging that our minds do. Simply put, we can think about things and we can feel about things. Thinking is probably fairly obvious. This is how we determine whether something makes logical sense or not. Given some pieces of information, does this conclusion seem logical? Does it make sense? Thinking can also involve deciding whether or not something is likely to work in the real world. The thought process goes something like this. If you do this, then this, then this, then this, then this outcome is likely to occur. This is the logical part of our mind that tries to remove feelings from its conclusions and tries to just be as impartial as possible. Lastly, we have the ability to make feeling-based judgments about things. Feeling as a judging process is all about value judgment. Something feeling bad is basically your mind making the judgment that the thing that made it feel bad is bad. For example, when you see somebody being mean to somebody else, that might invoke a bad feeling within you. That's your feelings making the judgment that being mean to other people is a bad thing. And then of course there are things that make you feel good, and that's your mind making the judgment that those things are good things. These feelings can either be sourced from an internal sense of morality that you hold as an individual, or they can also just be sourced from looking at other people around you and sympathizing with the situations that they find themselves in. And that's pretty much it. That's literally all our minds can do. We perceive by sensing and intuiting, and we judge by thinking and feeling. Every person on Earth can do each of these things. However, our personality types are basically derived from what our mind has a preference for, what it does more of and what it does less of. In the next few videos, I'm going to go through how each of these functions we discussed, sensing, intuiting, thinking, and feeling, can be split into an introverted and extroverted variant and how those operate very differently from each other. Once we split these functions into their introverted and extroverted variants, we end up with 8 functions in total. We're going to be referring to these as cognitive functions from here on out. They're pretty much the bread and butter of the entire MBTI framework, and so it's really important to get a good understanding of what each of them does. So I advise paying attention to this module.